Okay, so I have my front and rear panels right sides together. The flap is sitting in the middle of the two, and I've just popped a few clips on just to kind of keep everything together. Now on one side I've made a mark that is 2.5 inches from the top edge, and I'm going to stitch from the top edge down to that 2.5 inch mark using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, using my construction length stitch, so just shy of 3. Just a couple of back stitches at the end there to secure my stitching. And then I'm going to take the seam ripper, and I'm going to remove the basting stitches from that top 2.5 inches on both sides. That's one side. For anybody wondering why I've got extra bits of duct tape, I've added one of my logo you know what I mean, the logo tags for my bags by bags of style. So I've removed the basting stitches from both sides there, and I'm going to very carefully just trim away the foam, but only from that area that's 2.5 inches that we've actually just stitched. And because I'm doing faux leather, I am making sure that I get rid of all of the basting stitches. All of the foam, should I say, sorry. Basting stitches, I've just done that. Having a moment. They happen more and more as I get older and older. My mum used to call them senior moments. I just think it's just age, I don't know about senior. I don't think I'm a senior. So there we go. I've removed the foam just from that top area. So I'm just going to take the clips out. Now, if you are using fabric for your exterior at this point, you can open these two panels up. You can open those up and you can press that seam open. I'm just going to get rid of the thread that's left from where I've removed my basting stitches there, because that will bother me. If you're using faux leather, now you can use a roller if you want to. You could even use a little bit of glue. I tend to just use my finger underneath when I'm stitching, and that just kind of holds that open. It's something that you get a bit of practice at if you're a regular faux leather stitcher. So anyway, we're going to turn this so that this whole panel is right sides up, and we are going to, I'm just opening that seam underneath, and we're going to make a mark that is 2 inches from the top edge. Let me just double check that it is 2 inches. It is 2 inches. So from that top edge on that seam, I'm just going to make a mark using my chalk marker that is 2 inches from the top edge. So it goes across both that side seam that we've just stitched in place. So now I'm going to take my strap connector. I'm going to turn it over so that the end that's got only got one layer sits directly onto that 2 inch mark that we've just made. Again, I'm flattening out that seam allowance underneath, and you need to make sure that it's sitting centrally. You'll see that that top bit's flapping over the top, and that's how it should be. I'm just going to pop a couple of clips in to hold those in place. And then I'm going to stitch from the start of that stitch line down, across, back up and across. So I'm going to make a big square. I'm going to and I can feel that that seam allowance on the back there is open. Oh, it's not now, I've just moved it. And what I want to try and do is drop my needle into the hole, the last hole that I stitched in. So I've got long threads at the beginning and the end. And you may have to fold your bag away. Let me just move the camera slightly, sorry. I'm just, if you kind of roll your bag out of the way, you should be able to do this quite easily. So I'm going in, I'm coming down the side of the strap connector. I'm going to pivot round to the bottom. I need to lengthen my stitch a little bit because I haven't lengthened it to my top stitch length, but it's fine, this won't actually be seen, so it's not at the end of the world. Along the bottom of the connector. Back up to the point where your stitching started, trying to land in that hole that was your last stitch hole. And then we're going to pivot and we're going to stitch across. Raise the needle, pull your work out from under the presser foot, long threads, trim off, take both of those, golly that's a long one, both of those threads from the front. I think we could reduce that one, that seems a little excessive. Using a self-threading needle, you can either do one at a time or you can be really lazy like me and put two through at the same time. Going back through that last stitch hole, taking them through to the back of your work, and you can see that seam has stayed open, which is the way it should be. And I'm just going to tie off the threads from the front with the threads from my bobbin. Take your hardware. Now in this instance I'm using D-rings. In previous examples I've used rectangle rings. It's very much up to you. If you use a rectangle ring you don't need what you call them, swivel clips, that's the word. So I'm going to take my D-ring and I'm popping it onto my strap connector, and I'm just going to push my strap connector down. And I need to have 5/8 of an inch above there so that I've got room to be able to do my top stitching when I need to. I'm just folding it over. Now, if you wanted to put two rivets one above the other, if you're using 3/4 inch hardware, then you might find it's easier to put one above the other. If you're using inch hardware, then you could put them side by side. But you need to make sure that your rivets sit as close to your hardware as you can. You don't want the hardware flapping about. Now I can't do rivets on camera simply because every time I do, I use a hammer. I've got a press, but I much prefer to use a hammer and rivet tool, and I find that it just makes my camera, it messes with the sound, and it generally makes my camera fall over. So I'm going to go and I'm going to pop my rivets in, and I'll come back to you once they're popped in. It's actually quite difficult to see because it's black, but it's sitting nicely. So I rather stupidly managed to take the second part of the video showing the second side connector being fitted with actually firing my video at the wall behind me. So this is another bag, same bag but just a different fabric. Makes your eyes get a bit funny, which is why I didn't use it for the videos, but I wanted to show you something else just in case you don't want to use rivets. So I fitted my first strap connector as per the first part of this video, and I've got I'm using a rectangle rather than a D-ring because I want to keep this bag for my holidays, and I don't really want to put rivets in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to stitch across. So if you've got a machine that can cope with the layers, and not all machines will cope with the layers, because you've got foam and all the fabric plus well, 4 layers of faux leather here, you can just stitch across underneath that D-ring. I'm going to put 2 lines because I think it's more secure that way. I'm leaving long threads at the start and the finish just to so I can pull them through to the back. And I'm just doing my second line of stitching. It's about 1/4 of an inch below the first line. It's not a measured amount, to be fair. I'm not measuring particularly. But you can see there we've got 2 lines of stitching underneath to secure that. So we don't need the rivets in there if you don't want to. So I'll finish off those thread ends in a minute, but I'm going to show you how to fit the other side. So we match up the other 2 sides and we use the measurements in the pattern. And I don't make a mark, I just kind of measure it and then put my finger there. And we are going to do exactly the same process as we've just done, really. We're going to stitch from that point that we marked up to the top. Just doing a couple of back stitches there to start with, just to secure my stitching. So I'm stitching from the mark that we made up to the top of the bag. I'm going to use my seam ripper, just get rid of that thread, to remove my basting stitches. On both sides. Only in that top part where you stitch the seam though, don't go any further than that. You want your foam attached further down. And then I'm going to, not with those scissors I'm not, and then I'm going to trim away the foam from the seam allowance on both sides. So if you don't want to use rivets to attach your straps, you don't need to. Or you could use a line of stitching and then a rivet. It's kind of up to you. So now we're going to be working inside of here. So I'm just going to press open that seam allowance. And this is sort of a cotton canvas kind of curtain fabric, so I can press it. So unlike the faux that you saw on the first side, on the first half of the video, which say I messed up because I actually fired it at the wall for the second half of the video, you have to kind of finger press the seam allowance open, but with this, because it's fabric, I can actually press it open. Now you're working inside of this gap, so it's difficult for me to show you what I'm doing, but I'm going to make the mark that I need to make. Let me just, what have I done there? Have I measured that wrong? Let me just check how far I've measured this one. Oh, it's fine. It's all right, just an optical illusion. So I'm going to make the mark that I need to make, follow the pattern inside. I'm literally just putting my finger on it. I'm going to pop my strap connector on that mark Let me just, I can open that up a bit so you can see. It is difficult to actually manipulate this so that you can see. There's my side seam. My connector is now sitting there, and the seam that goes up the middle is central on my connector. So I'm just going to pop a clip to hold it in place at the top. It just makes it easier. And then I'm going to pull this part of my bag out of the way, and I'm going to stitch across, down and round the bottom half of that connector in the same way as you did with the first one. And I'm going to leave long threads at the beginning and the end so that I can bury them. I do tend to leave it to the end to bury as many of my threads as I can, which is lazy really. You can kind of pull the rest of your bag out of the way. It's not going to be a nuisance. Do be careful that you don't go off the edge of your connector. And if you're using faux leather, you may need to put your finger underneath just to, or cork even, to make sure that your seam allowance stays open. So your connector's going down so that the bottom edge on that mark is the edge where you've cut away the piece at the back of the connector. The piece that's cut away is actually right sides together with the sides of the bag, so you can't see it. It just reduces the thickness by one layer, which you don't really need. Raise my foot, pull my work out, and you can see that that's now fully attached. You can see the stitching on there, and I've got my two threads here that are the leftover threads, so I'm just going to literally, I'm going to pull this thread on the back to get the little loop from the front to come through, simply because I don't actually have a self-threading needle here. I used it with something else and haven't brought it back in, so I'm just going to do it the old-fashioned way. So now I have 4 threads on the back, and I'm going to tie those all off together. It just means that you don't end up with any big bits of back stitching on the front of your work, or on the visible part of your work. So I can now remove my clips. Again, I'm using a rectangle as opposed to a D-ring. So I'm going to fit my rectangle over my connector, push it down, and I'm going to stitch across in the same way as I did with the first one. So now we have the connector sitting on the top of the bag, and I have pulled my connector over, making sure that it's nice and straight. Again, long threads, beginning and end. And I'm just going to stitch across underneath I'm just going to make my stitch length a little bit bigger. Underneath the connector once. And twice. And again, I'm just going to bury my threads underneath. Now I'll do that in a moment, so you know how to bury threads, you don't need to see me doing it. But now you have both sides with the connectors on, we're going to move on to stitching the bottom piece. Now there's a part in this bottom piece that you can do or you can leave off. It's very much your call. It does take a little bit of manipulating. I just realised I haven't put any duct tape on there. It does take a little bit of manipulating, but it makes the bottom of this bag really nice and flat. So I'll come back and show you how to do that in a second.